do want to record these meetings to ensure that we have a record and support as best as we can consistency with Sunshine Law on top of all of the other minutes and meeting notes that we take and that you all have been informed about in terms of your participation. So thanks, Haley, for tuning that in. Okay, moving us right along. Agenda item number 2 is acceptance of notes from meeting number 1. I did receive some grammatical and typographical. There was a misspelling of a name, but curious at this time, hopefully you've had a chance to review the meeting notes. There's not really the same formal process that you might be familiar with in terms of neighborhood boards and how they accept minutes. Generally, we're just looking for, is there anything glaring that we need to make sure we edit or update? Otherwise, it's a consensus of acceptance of the notes. Any questions on that at this time? Seeing none, that gets us right along into the presentation and discussion items of today's meeting. So on the agenda, we have a project update from our lead consultant, Susan Assam, and she'll explain a little bit more about what ICF is supporting the city on, really talking about what the departments have been doing, how the community meetings and these advisory meetings feed into that process, and show some of the future opportunities for this advisory HUI to make recommendations for future project decision points. And she'll explain sort of the stepwise, fairly methodical process that we're engaged in at this point so that we are taking the hard look and really understanding the consequences of climate hazard impacts. But before that, I just wanted to give a recap and maybe a brief reminder or intro for some of the people who weren't able to join us last time, that we're talking about Climate Ready Oahu, and it's really an effort and a project to develop climate adaptation strategy for the island. And the adaptation strategy is a direct outcome of the community-sourced Oahu resilience strategy, as you can see represented here. And the adaptation strategy itself is intended to inform and support other existing planning and decision-making processes that a lot of you are probably fairly familiar with in terms of the hazard mitigation plan or the community plans, departmental functional plans, and we're really trying to make strong recommendations towards decision-making alignment and future decisions. As you can see here, we're still in phase 1, and under that, we're again really trying to understand the climate hazards and their consequences. And to recap what was done in round 1 community engagement meetings, you can see highlighted in the red box or in the bullets on the right, we provided more explanation about climate changes and local action at the state and city level. We did a survey really gauging people's understanding and take on climate hazard impacts today and into the future, and then started a discussion around guiding principles for climate change adaptation. And at the participate page at the project website, you can view all of the round 1 materials, including a recording of one of the 3 sessions. The survey itself that you all participated in is still open, so we appreciate your support in extending that. And then the presentation slides are also there. And then just last week, we wrapped up round 2, another series of 3 community meetings, really this time focusing in on understanding the climate hazards and their exposure, as well as a discussion that we'll engage you on today in terms of thinking through specific adaptation action areas that are intended to really help us navigate sort of interdepartmental, intergovernmental community concerns around climate hazards. And then lastly, we have the work that you all have been doing, and you can see again, utilizing the advisory HUI's webpage as the repository for all the meeting materials. We have everything from meeting number 1, including the survey that you all engaged in, as well as the notes from that meeting and a recording. Similarly, following this meeting, we'll do the same. We'll put any of the presentation slides, the recording, and anything that is an interactivity, we'll make sure that's available. And the work that we're going to be doing today through the agenda is to continue the discussion in support towards the next phase of developing adaptation action areas, as well as continuing to help us think through setting up the frameworks for decision-making alignment in the latter parts of the project. And then just to close it out, you likely remember when we had the discussions around guiding principles for adaptation. We'll make sure that we are, looking at the data and the inputs in a variety of ways. We obviously want the whole picture, but it's also helpful to understand, what you all as a body think and are sharing specifically around whether it's the strategies or the top areas of concern. Here's an example of just a word cloud from the activity that we did with you, and you can see on the left what sort of the frequency of words that the advisory who we shared relative to the frequency of words that the community shared with us. So, we're trying to make sure that there's a multitude of avenues for collecting information as well as processing and understanding sort of the sentiment of who is saying what across the community. And then lastly, before handing it off to Susan, and you're all aware of this as you went through the survey, we took the City Climate Change Commission's climate change brief, refined and worked with departments to think through some of the top climate hazard impacts. And this included sea level rise and coastal hazards, changes in rainfall, whether too much or too little, as well as increasing temperatures through time, because we really want to make sure that the actions and decisions that we're taking moving forward are commensurate with the challenges that we already face today and that we know will grow into the future, so that we do become sea level wise as a community, that we're taking all the measures we need to become flood ready, and that we're taking really immediate and appropriate actions to beat the heat so that people can actually connect with each other outdoors into the future. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Susan to talk us through a little bit more detail again about what the departments have been engaged in, as well as share out with you some of the next steps as we move on into the project phases. Susan.
Great, thanks. Yeah, let's dive in. So if you go to the next slide. All right, so this is a schematic showing you about our department engagement process throughout the project. So we first identified just who we needed to be talking to at the departments. And then we started with surveying them about climate hazards. And we also worked with them to conduct department interviews where we were trying to immediately get from the departments the knowledge that they had about the consequences of these climate hazards occurring. And so that was the initial input into this risk assessment process that I'm going to be talking about over the next several slides. The risk assessment process is feeding into the development of the adaptation strategies. So, so we got their feedback on climate hazards to help inform the 5 climate hazards that we're focusing on the climate risk assessment. We got input from these interviews about consequences associated with those climate hazards. And then we also got input in terms of these top areas of concern, which you're going to see popping up as we talk today about the adaptation action areas. Where are the actual areas on the island that we think are top areas of concern? Last week, we did a risk assessment working session. That's the pink box. And that was basically our opportunity to reflect back to the departments. We've taken all the information that you've given us in terms of climate hazards, the consequences. We put that into the risk assessment framework that we're using to display for them, here's what you said, what we found based on across those interviews, as well as documents that we were reviewing in terms of the consequences and the likelihood of these 5 climate hazards that we're looking at. We had an interactive virtual session with them where they were helping to provide feedback on whether they thought that the scores, using the rubric that I'll show you in a few slides, was appropriately applied or not. Now we're going to be moving into this effort to think about these adaptation action areas in more earnest with your help today. And that will be where we're focusing on developing adaptation strategies, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So let's move to the next slide. So this working session last week that I mentioned, the objectives of that were to really refine the risk assessment consequence ratings and justifications that we built up based on the interviews as well as the literature that we reviewed. And then to also have the departments weigh in on the selection criteria for the adaptation action areas and just give us some feedback on some of the initial survey results that we had gotten from departments in terms of adaptation action areas of concern. So
and I'll just stress too that the sort of the determination of those criteria is also on the agenda for today and is the agenda item right after this discussion.
So you can be thinking about it. All right, so what I'm going to do is give you a bit of a snapshot in terms of the methodology and results for this climate risk assessment. Some of these slides are actually, what we were presenting to the departments last week. So just want to give you enough information to, to have a sense of what we're accomplishing and how we're doing it. So next slide. All right, so just a few key terms that we probably will throw out. I've already used the term climate hazard multiple times. So how we're defining that are changes or events that would result in major impacts to the city and county of Honolulu. We're talking about them in terms of this concept of shocks, such as a hurricane, major storm event, or stresses like a more gradual onset sea level rise. And the risk assessment looks at the likelihood and the consequences of these climate hazards. So likelihood, you can see here, is defined as the expected frequency of the climate hazard occurring, or that there's a critical threshold that's being crossed in terms of a stress. And then the consequences are the measure of the severity of the impacts from a climate hazard. And we'll show you briefly these rubrics that we're using for that. And then risk is a function of likelihood and consequences. So you'll see that as we move through the next several slides. All right, so this is just the really basic risk assessment methodology. This is consistent with risk assessment methodologies beyond the Climate Ready Oahu one, basically starting with understand the context, moving into identifying the hazard and risks, analyzing them, and evaluating them. And you can see kind of the subparts of those, which I've been using this terminology as we present. Again, we're taking a very engagement-driven approach, and by that we mean that we're working really closely with the departments. They've been really incredible in terms of, just providing us with a lot of institutional knowledge as to, how do these types of events really play out? What are the consequences? As well as, really demonstrating that they've thought a lot about this. I've been quite encouraged, that the departments are giving a lot of thought to many of these climate hazards, even if they don't have an official plan on their shelves. All right, so here's the climate hazards that I mentioned that we're looking at, the 5 that we honed in on based on what we saw in terms of climate exposure, as well as what we were hearing from the departments as in terms of the climate hazards of greatest concern. So you can see that we've defined a scenario for each of them. A scenario just is representative of one permutation to really illustrate the types of consequences associated with that hazard. So we find that we really need to define and put some bounds on a scenario to move through the risk assessment in terms of identifying the likelihood and the consequences associated with that. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but you can see how we've defined these climate hazards for this exercise. Next.
And these will come back around towards the end, sort of as a segue into the next agenda item.
Yeah, and I guess one more thing that I'll mention is this 2050 that's up here in the title. So the time frame that we're looking at, which is part of the understanding the context, framing this whole risk assessment, is we are looking over the next 30 years to that sort of mid-century point. And I'll just mention with the sea level rise and coastal erosion, we're talking about the incremental impact, since we're looking at a 3.2 feet by 2100 scenario, but recognizing that that's not just going to be 3.2 feet suddenly in 2100, that there's a trajectory to get there. All right, so this just gives you a basic matrix, for what I was saying earlier, where risk is a function of likelihood and consequences. So you can see likelihood on the left side going from almost certain down to rare, consequences going from left of insignificant over to right of catastrophic. The colors are showing you kind of how extreme is the risk. So you can see in the top right corner that if it's almost certain to happen and it's catastrophic consequences, you're looking at an extreme risk, versus something that's in the lower left quadrant that would be, hardly ever going to happen and the consequences are insignificant. Maybe it's really a negligible risk. So that's what we're trying to really get a handle on through this risk assessment process. Next. All right, and this is the consequence categories that we're using. So we needed to define, how are we thinking about consequences? We put them into these three big buckets of population, economy, environment, and culture. And then you can see that we've got subcategories within those. So physical health and safety, mental health, community cohesion and equity, economic prosperity, infrastructure, environment, and culture. And again, we've been getting feedback from the departments about consequences in these different categories related to those climate hazards that we're focusing on.
And I would just add that in the round 2 community meetings that were held last week, this is in essence the same material presented in a different way that we were engaging people in, really helping to extend the thought process around navigating these top areas of concern specific to the hazard, but also honing in on these different categories because we know they have different impacts either locally or consequences for the island as a whole. So actually these 3 categories of population, sort of people and places, the environment and the culture of that place, as well as the economy of the island, will again be the first part of the activity for the next agenda item.
Great. So this is just giving you insight into the likelihood rating scale that we're using. How are we defining a shock event as very likely? We're saying it's an event that it's expected to happen about 15 or more times in a 30-year period, down to something that's very unlikely. It's not expected to happen over the 30-year period. And then you can see that the stress events are more focused on crossing critical thresholds and the likelihood of doing so. So you can move to the next, I think, very busy slide. So this is the consequence rating scale. So this is, again, the rubric that we're using, that we had the departments using when they were looking at, especially in this workshop last week, where we were saying, okay, we've given this climate hazard a 4 for physical health and safety. Do you agree in terms of the number of people affected? Or we've given it a 3 in terms of economic prosperity. Is that making sense given, how we've defined these different levels of severity? So this is just kind of the key to, how we're rating the consequences. All right, so here's our draft results that we went into the meeting with the departments. This will be revised as we take the feedback from the departments that we got at that working session on Wednesday. So that's what we're working on now. So please don't take this as the final. They are definitely the draft results. These results are based on those initial interviews with the departments, as well as our initial review of literature and past studies that have been done. So you can see the rating in the rightmost column of high and medium for these different climate hazards, and then you can see where they fell on the matrix, that likelihood and consequence matrix. So you can actually see the risk score as well. So that's the product of the likelihood and consequence ratings. And I think we're going to see probably some of the consequences increasing a little bit based on the conversations that we had last week during the working session. So if you go to the next slide, I think that'll actually be helpful. So this shows you the draft results in a little bit of a different format. The bars going up are the consequence ratings, and you can see the colors correspond with the different consequence categories. The black dot is the actual score on there of risk, the risk score. So you can see, for example, that sea level rise and coastal erosion, as well as increase in temperature, have the highest total consequences. And you can see, therefore, that hurricane is actually coming up a little bit lower on risk because likelihood is lower. So again, these two factors, likelihood and consequence, really do drive, the overall risk. But it's interesting and informative to look at just how are the consequences, how have those been rated for each of these. Yeah, next slide. All right, so in moving from this climate risk assessment, which really gives us a sense of where are the greatest risks from the standpoint of just across the island, which hazards are emerging as the greatest risk, that helps to inform us in terms of adaptation strategies. How we're approaching developing adaptation strategies is to define these adaptation action areas. And we're doing so because it helps us explore different adaptation options for the different climate hazards and to think about some of the potential compounding impacts of different climate hazards. Our goal is to be developing adaptation strategies for city infrastructure and services. And we want to be thinking about cross-cutting and overarching strategies that are going to require collective action to protect multiple pieces of infrastructure. So we want to be thinking across departments and maybe even beyond departments. And then also, how are these different approaches going to integrate into city plans and policies, as Matt mentioned previously. We're also factoring in and thinking about those guiding principles for adaptation that Matt talked about earlier that's been received from the community feedback. So we're not trying to prioritize communities. We're not trying to rank communities and say this one is the worst, this is the biggest issue. We're really trying to just identify some of the top areas of concern so that we can start to dig in on some of the very specific adaptation strategies that would help to increase the resilience of those areas or ones like them. All right, so how are we going to select them? These are draft criteria for selecting these adaptation action areas. So we want to definitely be taking into account the city departments and what do they see as the top areas of concern by each climate hazard. We've already surveyed them about that. These round 2 sessions have been getting some feedback from the public about each of their top areas of concern by each climate hazard. And then both from the public and the departments, we've been getting thoughts from them in terms of top area of concerns for disruptions to people, the environment, and the economy. So thinking about where is there the greatest potential for disruptions that we want to avoid by implementing adaptation strategies. We also want to be thinking about the diversity of areas that we're selecting, thinking about the different types of communities, the different types of hazards, the different types of infrastructure that are in these different action areas, as well as where there might be opportunities that are upcoming where this work, this development of adaptation strategies could feed right into something like a community plan update or some other, fortuitous forthcoming activity where, really we could kickstart the effort of getting towards implementation on adaptation if we seize that opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. And everyone, again, this is in essence agenda item 4. So you'll see these specific draft evaluation criteria again, and that'll open it up for the discussion because as presented in the agenda, we're really looking for your suggestions and recommendations across a variety of items, including the evaluation criteria, engagement, and stakeholder participation.
Great. All right. So, so next steps in terms of just the project playing out. We are currently integrating that departmental feedback from last week's working session into what will be the final risk assessment. Engaging the public and the community advisory HUI, that's happening today and was happening this past week as well. Hoping or aiming to finalize the selection of these adaptation action areas by the end of the month. And then we'll be developing the department specific as well as some cross-cutting adaptation strategies and moving into that December and January.
Great, thanks, Susan. I'm gonna, before we take any questions that you may have for Susan, I'm gonna just very quickly go through those hazards again to reinforce sort of the thought process and the information that people have been engaged in over the past week. As Susan mentioned, those 5 climate hazards that were identified as top concerns and that you all engaged in meeting number 1 include hurricanes and tropical storms. And as a reminder from the climate change brief, obviously we currently experience tropical storms even though we've never had direct landfall in recorded history on this island. However, more frequent tropical cyclones are projected for the waters near Hawaii, not necessarily because more storms will be forming, but because the change in the ocean temperatures and air temperature will allow more storms to track a little bit more northward, putting the state in the crosshairs. And this hazard includes obviously a landfall of a major hurricane, including storm surge and inland flooding. And what was presented to the departments was this compilation map that showed our existing 500-year floodplain, or a 0.2% chance that such a rain event could happen in any given year, plus some storm surge modeling that we have from NOAA. However, the one thing that's really important to note on this map is that storm surge is not something that happens uniformly all at once all around the island. It's extremely dependent on the approach of a storm and the intensity of the storm. Then we asked, somewhat similar question regarding precipitation, where we have information both on a stress or a changing trend, where the climate change brief tells us that the windward side is projected to get wetter, and wetter specifically during the wet season, and that heavy rainfall events such as rain bombs have become more common. And this, for example, 4 inches or more of rain in an hour. For context, the East Honolulu flooding in April 2018 and Waimanalo, if you were to look at, I believe it was the New Valley rain gauge, there was a 15-minute period of greater than 1.25 inches of rainfall. So if you extrapolate that, that's more than 4 inches of rain in an hour. So that's a fairly significant episodic event that we really don't necessarily have that much forewarning for in comparison, obviously, to a tropical storm. And then on sea level rise and erosion, I think we're all fairly familiar with the state sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation report. What the graphic shows is not only the combined sea level rise exposure area, but also areas of concern for our coastal highways or other major roadways. And those are those areas in orange depicted on the map. So, we know that we're on a trajectory to experience about 1 meter or 3.2 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century. But we also know that we will experience impacts during high tides or other coastal hazard events decades before then. And it's also important to remember that this hazard includes actually a compilation of 3 exposures, which are passive coastal and groundwater flooding or areas becoming permanently wet. It also includes annual high wave flooding, areas that will become wet on an annual basis, and coastal erosion or the permanent loss of land. The 4th hazard was decreased precipitation, where the climate change science tells us that the leeward side of the island is expected to become up to 60% drier by mid-century. And we know that prolonged drought can have significant consequences for a variety of sectors, our own human health, our water resources generally, and then other compounding effects on evaporation, temperature, humidity, etc. And that brings us to the final hazard, which was looking at increasing temperature. So again, looking towards mid-century, we're expected to experience an increase in annual average temperature of about 2.7 to 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And the map on the far right shows community heat assessment from volunteer collected data from August 31st of last year. It's really hard to see it, obviously, on your computer or your phone. But in essence, there's some really, really dark red areas that said we already know that across Oahu, it can feel either 105 degrees or higher today. So what do we need to do to make sure that we mitigate the consequences of either episodes like that or just the general increasing trends of temperature? So with all that, before we head off into the next activity, which really builds from the information Susan just provided, I want to obviously pause and see if we have any questions from the advisory WHOI members. We also know this is a lot of information to take in, but we wanted to be as forthcoming about what the departments are doing, because again, the intention around the advisory WHOI itself is to provide us recommendations and your thoughts at the different decision-making stages of the project.
This is Matt Geyer with Faith Action. Is the increasing likelihood of fires a part of the droughts and increasing temperature in your calculations, I guess?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Wildfire is something that could be looked at discreetly, but we certainly are making sure that we don't lose sight of some of the compounding effects, right? So sort of decreases in precipitation, perhaps as a major driver towards wildfire. So that's something that we'll definitely need to come back to and keep in mind as we get into the next stages around the adaptation strategies of like, what are the ramifications of a main driver or change in climate that then itself has impacts? Good question, Matt.
So Matt, this is Mike Onofrietti, and actually I had a question along those same lines, but sort of the opposite way. If the windward side is going to get increased precipitation during the rainy season, and it's going to be drier in the summer, that actually has an exponential impact on wildfires during the summertime. So things like clearing out underbrush and undergrowth can become pretty critical issues. Just because it's wetter in the winter doesn't mean that it's going to reduce wildfires necessarily. It actually could have the opposite impact if it's significantly drier in the summer.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. Would Island Insurance be willing to share some of their modeling with us to help us think through these scenarios? That was kind of a joke, but
yeah, I was going to say I would if we had done any.
Yeah, but your additional insights into like understanding risk, we really appreciate that. So keep firing away if you guys have questions for myself or Susan, or just reactions to the content so far.
No, I think it's very good. I did have a question on sort of the evaluation criteria a few slides back. Are they intended to be each? Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of cross-level impacts on this, and I think that the measurements of mental health, people issues, environmental issues, and sort of the stack chart is a really good way of expressing that. As long as these particular criteria we're going to look at sort of the interrelation between them, I think that's going to become really critical, so we don't end up missing something by missing the compounding effects of multiple concerns hitting from a single issue.
Yeah, Mike, can I ask that you hold that thought? We definitely want to come back to it. And again, this presentation and discussion specifically on the evaluation criteria is the next agenda item. So we want to make sure that we have a full discussion on that.
Oh, my bad, thanks.
Nope, no worries. Any other questions from the advisory members at this time? For Susan or myself, or just general reactions to the content?
Hi, this is Kathy Camp. I think you guys did a great job. It's very comprehensive and collected a lot of really good information at this stage. My concern is that it's so much and it's so in-depth and broad at the same time, right? It covers so many different areas, and this is a big issue for the island. I'm wondering if there's any way, and maybe this comes in the evaluation component, of how do we prioritize, because we are on an island, we do have limited resources, and to help direct if you can do these A, B, C, D, you've covered at least, you've hit or resolved some of the bigger issues, however we prioritize, or however we determine the impacts. And I just get worried that the report can be so voluminous that we will have so many different initiatives to work on that we won't be able to move the meter in any direction.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Kathy. We certainly want to caution against that as well, because we're really trying to put forth strong recommendations for decision-making alignment for obviously a new mayor coming in and a new potential majority council coming in, especially as the project timeline is really looking towards September of next year, which for those that aren't familiar, as soon as the city starts its fiscal year on July 1st, you get like a month to catch your breath, and then you immediately start thinking about what's the next budget. So we want to make sure that there's really tangible things that we can start approaching. And we tried to do that with the resilience strategy as well, where we had these working groups that said, here's 200 things we want you to do. And ultimately, through some prioritization and winnowing process with the working groups and city departments, we came forward with 44, which still can be quite a bit, but certainly want to think about exactly what you just said, Kathy. And just another comment, and then I'll ask Susan to offer up additional thoughts. So the effort right now of working towards the adaptation action areas is really to get towards moving from the island scale towards about a handful of literal geographies that are smaller, that really help us think through the issues that we're discussing. And then once we get into the adaptation strategy development, similarly thinking through prioritization of any of those to meet, whether it's the criteria that you just said, right? We don't want it to be so comprehensive that it's almost unusable, because it doesn't tell you what to do first or which direction to go. So we'll keep coming back, obviously, to the advisory group, really looking for that gut check and like, does this make sense to you as an organization, to you as a resident of this island? Any thoughts on how to improve upon the presentation of the material so that community and leaders have a better sense of really what needs to be done? Susan, any additional comments regarding sort of prioritization into the latter stages?
I think you said it really well, which is, the intent of these adaptation action areas is to really get adaptation strategies that are tailored to specific types of areas that we think will also be transferable to other areas on the island, but to get down to a level of specificity so that it is a really actionable adaptation strategy rather than just staying at a really high level, which we've seen a lot around the country, where the adaptation strategies are maybe a laundry list of 150 potential adaptation strategies that are not tied to a specific location, and it's hard to move beyond that. So you're bringing up great points that we had in mind in terms of designing, how do we make this project something that allows to move more quickly into implementation.
Any other comments from advisory HUI members on this agenda item before we open it up to members of the public?
I have one.
Thanks, Karen.
This is Karen Folk. Hi. Just to kind of add on to what Kathy was talking about and where this discussion with prioritization, looking at a global level, there's a lot of mention of how things are done on the mainland. Obviously this is a global effort that we're working on, but really honing in on these actionable items and what are the specific, I don't want to say roadblocks or stumbling blocks we have being on an island, and how tangible and how movable are they in where we are today, and in the next 5 years, and even playing into consideration the pandemic and where that puts us, right? So the island part of it, I think it's easy to look at the strategy on a global level and even hone it down, but how are we effective? How are these things different for us here on an island, and on that specific, how does that affect the prioritization of where we're sitting at today? I just want to add that thought into the process too.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. I think that'll be really important even for sort of meeting number 3 as we continue the discussion of commensurate strategies to address the problems, but then also making sure that it's contextual and something accomplishable by us in an island setting and as an island community. So we'll keep coming back to you all to make sure, and certainly will be dependent upon your additional thoughts and not just sort of what departments are are keying in on, because sometimes we can have somewhat narrow focus if we're just thinking about our infrastructure or our assets or how we think we can and should provide services island-wide. Appreciate that. Any last comments from the advisory HUI members? If not, any members of the public, if you have a specific comment on this agenda item. I see we have a couple of non-members. Certainly welcome your thoughts before we move on to the next agenda item. Hearing none. Before we do move on, I just want to, for advisory members that maybe joined in process, you'll probably note now that your name has an M dash before you. That's just for us on the facilitation side. It helps us keep track in the participant list more readily who are members and who are members of the public. I did want to ask, there is someone who's on the phone, last 4 digits 8081. Are you on the phone as well as identified in the participant list by a name? Supports us with the record keeping if you're able to identify, or maybe just confirm with Haley Cook, our tech lead, who you are. I'm gonna keep moving us along in the meeting, but also I wanted to say thank you to Susan for joining us in the late afternoon to provide a project update. We'll make sure it's very appropriate, obviously, in these meetings to provide general project updates as well as specific discussion items. So we'll probably tee up Susan or ensure I'm as well equipped as possible to provide those updates into meetings 3, 4, and 5. Okay, moving us right along, and it's really great discussion so far on the activity and keying in on these hazards, as well as the categorization of economy, people, culture, environment. What we're going to do now is a very brief virtual activity, which will then feed into the discussion of the adaptation action area evaluation criteria that Mike teed us up quite well to re-engage in. So to give you a sense of what we're doing today, and actually what we've been doing in the community meetings so far, is to help us think about different scales for actions and interventions. Again, sometimes it's nearly impossible to turn island-wide considerations into something real and actionable. So what we're endeavoring to do today with you all is to, again, think about specific geographies or for adaptation action areas. And obviously we know from the individual all the way up to the island scale, everything is important in between. But when we get into the specific activity, what we're trying to key in on is really sort of this neighborhood or town community scale as demonstrated here in this graphic. Because we are trying to think at different scales, and we know, as Susan mentioned, sometimes we know we're not trying to prioritize a community over another. We're trying to find these case examples that will help us think through the different information. And sometimes that requires thinking about others' experiences and different experiences around the island. And it can sometimes be potentially uncomfortable to offer concerns about certain areas of the other. But again, this is not in any way, shape, or form to indicate that we're not thinking about adaptation all around the island. We're trying to key in on 5 locations that will allow us to explore adaptation option areas for the hazards, consider strategies for city infrastructure and services, find examples that allow us to think cross-cutting and overarching, whether it's interdepartmental or intergovernmental, develop these approaches to integrate it into our plans and policies, explore compounding impacts like some of you have offered already, as well as ensure that the sort of guiding principles for adaptation are driving the discussion moving forward. So with all that, in essence, what we'll be doing in 2 breakouts, just in a second here, is basically the same way you would in a community meeting in person, walk around and start putting comments, whether it's sticky notes or post-it notes or dots up on a map. We're gonna utilize Zoom's annotate function. And I'm gonna ask Haley to walk us through to get people a little akamai and comfortable with the Zoom annotate. We do have a couple of folks who are on their phones, which is a little bit more challenging, but still possible to participate. So I'm gonna ask Haley to explain a little bit more for those that are unfamiliar with the Zoom annotate function.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So for folks on the computer, you should see at the top of your screen a green banner that says you are viewing Matthew Gonzer's screen. And to the right of that, there should be a gray menu called View Options. And when you click on that button, you'll get a drop down, and one of your options is Annotate. Once you click Annotate, you'll get a new menu bar that has a whole bunch of different features. So you should have the ability to draw lines and pick stamps, and you choose your colors and all kinds of things. So we encourage you here, I can see people have got the hang of it already, to test out that feature. Encourage you to use stamps. It's super simple and easier to get exactly where you want on the map. But try and test out that Annotate feature by telling us where you live, work, and play. And if you are on the phone, it'll be a little bit different. You should see a pencil or a pen icon that you can click on, and that'll give you the option to draw arrows. And if you do have any issues, please let us know in the chat.
So again, on the phone, it can quickly move from fun to frustrating just because of the dexterity that we may have or accessing all the things. On the phone, you're more limited to lines and or arrows. This is just the testing phase. When we go into the breakouts, which will be facilitated by Ujay and myself, if the Zoom annotate is just too much and it's not really working for you, please make sure that you just enter your thoughts in the chat or offer them up audibly, and we'll have that on record, and that'll make it easy for us to process the information after the meeting. I think all this stuff really highlights the promises and pitfalls of the virtual engagement space, when more often than not, it's easier to just walk around McKinley High School cafeteria and put your sticky note on a map and then get your cookies and go. But it looks like some folks are getting pretty accustomed to it. Before we do split off into groups, does anyone have like a real annoyance on this so far? We'll make sure to capture, again, your comments in the text or just using your voice. But we want to move on and look at 3 maps specifically for about 12 to 15 minutes before we come back as a full group for the discussion.
Hey,
Okay,
Matt,
people,
this is Kathy. Hold on.
hey, Kathy, you might be on. Okay.
I am. I'm
Twice.
trying to unmute. Yeah. Okay, hold on. I'm going to go away from somewhere.
Okay.
But I opened up my iPad and I'm trying to figure out how to do it on my iPad.
I imagine it's closer to phone. Is that correct, Haley?
Yes, I think on a tablet there might be a button. It should appear automatically when you're looking at somebody else's screen that there's a pen icon, maybe in the bottom left corner.
I did. I saw that. Okay.
Okay.
So just use that. Okay.
Choose that.
All
Yep.
right, thanks.
And again, everybody, we know, we did a fair amount of like interactivity and polling last time. This is not intended to be like the end all be all of our discussion. When we come back from the breakout groups, that's really where we have the opportunity to re-engage on the content. But we wanted to make sure that you had some opportunity similar to the departments to key in on the specific categories of impacts to people and places, impacts to the environment and culture of that place, as well as impacts to the economy of the island as a whole. So that's me telling you what we're about to engage in. You will see the island of Oahu, 3 times, completely blank maps, and there will be questions and prompts on the left-hand side that Ujay and I will talk you through. So we're really asking, with those hazards in mind of hurricane, including storm surge and flooding, changes in rainfall patterns, including heavy rain events, sea level rise and coastal erosion, decrease in precipitation, as well as increasing temperatures through time. So with all that, Haley will split us up into randomly assigned small breakout groups. We'll do that for about 12 to 15 minutes, but what's more important is when we come back to engage on the draft evaluation criteria. So each time, again, Ujay and myself will offer up the map. We'll go through doodling all over it. We will save that graphic. We'll clear the map, and then we'll move on to the next graphic. So with that, to show you the power of the facilitator, I have just cleared all of your stuff because you're all super savvy on navigating the Zoom. Annotate the breakout groups will additionally, oh, Mona's back on, good on you. We will similarly be recording the breakout groups for the record as well. So with that, Haley, please send us far afield into the ether, and then everyone, we will be back right around 4:45 to continue the full group discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I just want to acknowledge Kathleen's comment in the chat there. Appreciate the note. And if, again, at any time you have difficulties with Annotate, please let your facilitator know, or feel free to drop your comments in the chat or voice them out loud. So I know we had difficulties sending people to breakouts last time, but I have faith in our technology today, and it should send you automatically. And I'm going to do that now.
That was perfect, Mike, right under the wire. Very punchy.
That was yeah.
It was good. It was really good.
For anyone that's wondering what we're joking about, he got his final word in right before we got ripped back, and it was basically like, if all there is Waikiki, we might as well be Miami. And I think that was with a little bit of disdain, but it was more a comment that yes, economic impacts are not just the beaches along the South Shore, but right, the North Shore as well, and everywhere else in between. So Haley, maybe once we have everyone back, if you could just confirm.
Yep, we should have everybody back.
Okay, and everyone, again, thank you for your participation through that whole process. I know the interactivity is somewhat difficult in the virtual space, but it's helpful for us, and it's directly related to this agenda item, obviously. And in essence, what we're really want to open up continued conversation on these draft evaluation criteria. As Susan mentioned, the departments went through a process just last week. We were engaging community members on this mapping activity last week through the 3 sessions. And in essence, now we obviously, after today's meeting, we'll process the advisory WHOI's participation along with the other engagements. But ultimately, we're going to have to think about how do we put forth a recommendation for, again, 5 adaptation action areas that allow us to think through and use as case examples to start to approach the multitude of adaptation needs, but also not just really about preparing ourselves for the worst, but how do we also capitalize on opportunities for improving environmental and community conditions in the face of changes that are coming to us. So this is just an open discussion around these draft bulleted evaluation criteria here. And I'll just go through them one by one again and then open it up to discussion. Top area of concern for city departments by each hazard. Top area of concern for the public, inclusive of the advisory WHOI and the community discussions for each hazard. top area of concern for disruptions to people, those categories that we just went through, disruptions to the environment in that place, and then disruptions to the economy of the island as a whole. Making sure that we're thinking about a diversity of geographies and communities and populations, along with the infrastructures that exist in those places, as well as upcoming opportunities that this work could feed into. For example, Kathleen's area, the North Shore Sustainable Communities Plan, as led by the Department of Planning and Permitting, will also be starting its update process in early 2021. So Mike, maybe if you wanted to offer up again your thoughts from the previous discussion to kickstart our group's thoughts here. And I'm grateful for Susan for sticking around. It's obviously directly related to our work and putting forth recommendations. None of these things have been evaluated yet. We're still tallying results. We could do some easy counting. They're not necessarily weighted at this point in time. We're very open to your thoughts around either adding or editing these draft evaluation criterias, and then we'll take your recommendations and think on those, as well as if you have thoughts on how to think through, like what Mike said, in terms of the concerns around compounding impacts or climate changes, then driving changes in other conditions.
Yeah, so my thoughts, Matt, were basically just around what you described, is that if we look at these as, 5 individual evaluation criteria, you'll get useful information, but there's a lot of interaction effects between the individual criteria. And in some cases, you don't want to over count stuff, but on the other hand, it's important that, a few different criteria that may individually not add up to much, when you look at the different areas and lump them together, in fact, it could be a pretty significant issue, both economically and to people and everything else. So that's kind of my thought. And I'm thinking about that, since I'm a math person, more as a statistician, about correlations between these types of criteria. Anytime you do this kind of sampling approach, you're going to have some correlations that can become useful in some cases, and in some cases, it can distort the results as well.
Any concerns at this time of, like, understanding a little bit more about the process that we've gone through, about the concerns of distorting the results?
I'm not sure about that yet, quite frankly. I think the discussion we just had in our breakout groups was actually a good example of that. You can get a really, really good sense of which areas were highlighted by multiple parts of the team for each of the subject questions. So those are ones that would end up being really, really important relative to the whole. So it may end up that it's not an issue because, quite frankly, a whole bunch of neighborhoods and communities will show up in every single area anyway. So it really it almost depends on what the results are, and then you just kind of have to block and tackle and dig through them in a little bit more depth to figure some of that stuff out, I think.
Sure. And as more people are thinking through their recommendations on this, just to give you all a sense, Susan mentioned this, that we're working towards finalizing the adaptation action areas, again, the geographies that will carry forward into the next phase at our monthly city resilience team meeting. So internally, sort of at like the sub-cabinet level for the last 3 years, we've had the city resilience team, which is representative of staff, directors, and deputies from more than a dozen departments that were integral in the resilience strategy process and continue to be integral in the implementation of these things.
Yeah, and just, one other thought, and another advisory group member mentioned this earlier, is there's going to be so much that's going to turn up as needing to be done. So prioritizing becomes extremely important. So you've got these evaluation criteria is one set of criteria prioritized higher than another. That becomes a really tough question to answer, but it's a question you probably are inevitably going to face.
Yeah, and just thinking ahead, want to make sure we don't, because of selection at this phase, don't want to preclude or close the door on potential considerations at the the next stages. Yeah, thanks for that. And Matt, thank you. I see your comment in the chat. Just as a a reminder, again, like we winnowed the hazards to some extent through the early phases, and obviously there's a whole multitude of other impacts to whether it's offshore or even high up in the mountains. Obviously, an agency like Board of Water Supply is extremely interested in the work in our rain catchment areas. But the intention around what we're trying to do is really think about, at this point, city infrastructure assets and the services that we provide. So we will keep coming back to the group and community of like, what is the hook or what is the thing that the city needs to do or has direct influence over to address some of the climate hazards and the science and the risk assessments to date. But we certainly don't want to lose sight of the consequences either offshore or things. We certainly need to stay attuned to even things that we're not necessarily directly in control of.
Hi, this is Aiko Yamashiro. I wanted
Aiko.
to, I think these evaluation criteria make a lot of sense. Of course, we want to think about the top areas of concern, and if there's a certain area that has a lot of concern, that would be an ideal site to look at. And I think one thing that's not on here that came out in the breakout for me is it also can be really helpful if the community itself is already strong. Like then they're better at observing and better at like talking about the changes that they're seeing. So you might get really good information. And the example I was thinking of was the one that I put in the chat when you were asking for environmental impact areas and where would be good sites. I thought that Paipaihe'ea fish pond area is such an interesting site to look at because they're doing so much observation and looking at the ocean level, but they're also talking very closely with whoever is Mauka of them. And it's just a unique where the ahupua'a kind of thing has been restored. So not necessarily saying they have to be the site, but that's an example to me of the community has been linked and they're already strong and already observing and already talking. So they have the strength that they could bring to the reporting potentially. And that could be some evaluative criteria to think about too. Thanks.
Do you have we definitely have that in the recording and the notes, just so everyone knows. Ujay is supporting us with real-time notes, and then we'll make sure we distill those ASAP so we can work on the activity going forward. That's a really good one to think of. And hopefully the mapping activity captured some of what you were thinking. Yep.
Hey, Matt, Pono here with a comment.
Hey, Pono.
Hey, yeah, so it was brought up in our breakout. I think Colby brought up someone in the community sessions might have alluded to the discrepancy between state and county zoning laws, you know, where we might have a specific zoning area that conflicts with something that state has. But I think my point is more policy involvement in this planning process, whereas if we have development policies that go unchecked, where we, for example, develop on prime ag land, you know, that critically impacts climate change. So if there's a way to, I know these are more infrastructure and hazard related, but if there's a way to consider the policy adaptation, I know that's kind of already being done, but policies or, you know, past practices could also impact us. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Pono. I want to acknowledge also Amy's question or just discussion point in the chat. Amy's alluding to an activity we had done through the resilience strategy development process where we mapped out some additional social vulnerability, utilizing a working group that was like, okay, yeah, there might be national models out there, but what are the sort of the variables or things that we believe are either most or perhaps more important to consider? I just dropped in the chat for anyone's interest the background on that work as well as access to some of those map resources. But yes, Amy, thank you. We do have those and they're part of the processes here as well. And Matt, your comment, extremely related, but I would reserve those thoughts. Those are going to become really important meetings 3, 4, and 5. as we start to think about how do we actually approach and think about how to address adaptation needs. You know, to Kathy's comment about we can't do everything all at once everywhere around the island at the same time. So what are the appropriate strategies? And we'll look towards you all for recommendations on how to do those. But again, the evaluation criteria agenda item here is to help us think through getting towards the action areas and the specific geographies that will be our case examples.
Thank you.
Yep. And I think, you know, I want to make sure that this is really sort of the biggest item on the agenda today. I do acknowledge that, you know, we're nearly 25 minutes from time. I want to give this at least another solid 5 minutes. And I think we'll be able to get through the other items shortly thereafter. But this is a really important one for us in the near term, as mentioned in the presentation. Hale, I can tell you that the Department of Environmental Services thinks about city sewers every day. So there's at least some folks out there that are thinking about wastewater management and services, as well as the gaps in wastewater management around the island. But I hear your comment. And again, that sounds like one that'll be really important once we get to the strategy development, but also, you know, it relates, I don't want to discredit how it relates to some of the evaluation criteria here, thinking about the infrastructure in places. So I hear your comment on that in terms of where the city has pipes, pumps, and plants and how that might be affected by the hazards.
I do want to mention though that I personally am working on a couple of the FAC plans for ENV.
Facility
so
plans for folks.
Yeah, sorry, the facility plans. So we are looking at, for ENV, we are looking at the specifically the climate change effects of like sea level rise, coastal erosion, storm surge on city infrastructure, like the sewers specifically. So we've completed that assessment. We're working on it right now for YNI, and we're also working on it for the Kailua area. So ENV is looking into that. So
thanks, Susan. And Steph, did you have any additional explanation to your comment? I think I understand somewhat, but would appreciate hearing it directly from you.
Sure, thanks, Matt. Just looking at it in, well, from 2 points of view, I guess, and this has been mentioned by others today, but recognizing the huge amount of work involved here and our ability and need to prioritize being extremely important, and therefore looking at those areas of overlap where we can make the most impact to people and environment and economy, et cetera. And I think on a flip side of that, you know, I can't help but think about this in terms of possible solutions as well. And what are those solutions that have co-benefits, for instance, and recognizing that this is somewhat a field of the city and county's kuleana, but I think of, for instance, the Nature Conservancy's real hard look at potentially artificial reefs and the benefits that those can play for people and economy and the environment, as opposed to, you know, building miles of concrete seawalls. So just offer that.
Yeah, which might then result in the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of detrimental to people, environment, economy. Yeah, thank you for that, Steph. Any additional comments from the advisory HUI members before we open it up to the community members? I would offer too that, you know, if, you know, more thoughts come to you after today's discussion, please don't hesitate to email me directly or give me a call. We do hope to process both this meeting's information as well as the department's final comments immediately next week so that we can continue to process a recommendation for these adaptation action areas for concurrence from the city's resilience team at the end of this month at our monthly meeting. Thank you, Jeannie, for the additional notes regarding the, you know, updating our standards and ensuring that that's an opportunity to make sure they are incorporating any of these climate hazard considerations. So any comments on this from the community members of the public? If not, I'm going to move us on. Again, really big thank you to you all. I know sort of the opportunity to participate as advisory members is really exciting, but sometimes it can be pretty heavy. We want to be as clear-eyed and open with you all in terms of how we're navigating these really difficult decision-making processes, because through this, we want to really put forth strong recommendations for whatever our guiding principles are, whether it's, you know, all of the above, community informed, risk informed, climate informed, but also realistic in terms of trying to take actions now to chip away at the either most immediate challenges or some of the more catastrophic things that might present themselves by mid-century. So thank you. Okay, moving us right along to the next two quick discussion items. We wanted to get your support and thoughts on recommendations to us in terms of how we can either improve, extend, or do more and additional community and stakeholder engagement. And you know, we got some good comments in meeting number 1 in the chat or verbally, and I wanted to share with you some of what we have on the table. But again, we really, one of the greatest strengths, I think, of this advisory HUI is the representation, whether it's geography, sector, or just really wonderful individuals that I know personally and professionally. And we welcome the opportunity to sort of have you use us so that you can make sure that we're connecting with anyone that might be interested and or affected and or benefit or have the vision to support the Climate Ready Oahu development. So very quickly, what we have done already, obviously, are the first 2 rounds of community engagement. As discussed earlier, that intro survey is still open, and it will be open for several more months to come. We had originally also provided a flyer and general information to the Neighborhood Commission office, which we understand was extended to all 33 of the neighborhood boards out there. Also a big mahalo to Shar, who I'm not sure if she was able to join us yet today. She actually invited us to engage the Waianae Neighborhood Board just before this project launched back in early October. We obviously have the next couple of series of what we're still calling future virtual engagements. It's really difficult at this point in time to anticipate what we may or may not be able to engage in regarding COVID restrictions into the future, as well as our health status at those different points in time. Optimism and fingers crossed all across the board on that. We obviously have 3 more meetings of this advisory HUI. And as mentioned before, we're more than willing to engage with any sectors or industries at any point in time, even if it's just a more informal or if there's presentations. As an example, I was part of a panel that talked a little bit about this project before it kicked off through NIOP and ULI, but there might be future opportunities for that kind of stuff. We will have a Visions of Oahu call for creative submissions that currently working with another colleague in my office, Lala Nuss, and she's supporting and connecting with folks in the arts industry to think through some basic prompts, but also potential different school-aged categories, as well as a more open category and some potential, maybe even the possibility for some awarding. The intent is that we know climate change is very heavy, so we also need to make sure that we're not just thinking about avoiding the worst, but what are the ways that we can be or take advantage of some of these opportunities to address these things head on, that then also translate into improved community and environmental conditions, and engaging folks on the hope and creative arts is something that we think will really even help us continue on in the project. And we would hope to have a gallery on the website, potential public displays of certain materials, as well as incorporation into the final product. And then finally, after some discussions with advisory member Brent Kakasako, who really provided some good thoughts in the previous meeting, we currently do have a scope of work that we are trying to solicit bids on for project promotion and participation. The intent is to engage with a community-based organization as a lead contractor, who then would bring on a handful of subcontractors that help us get to specific demographics, specific geographies, whatever their more on the ground community network is, to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to engage with those folks all around the island. So that's, again, just a snapshot of what we have done, what we currently have lined up for the work, but also really appreciate and value your thoughts, recommendations, or assistance in scheduling people's time to engage on this project. So opening up for discussion on your recommendations for community and stakeholder engagement.
Hey, Matt, it's Dan Janelle. I was wondering what kind of outreach has happened for the military community?
None directly, but just we were fortunate that there were several members of Marine Corps Base Hawaii joined us in one of the community meetings yesterday. We haven't done any direct engagement with, whether it's NAVFAC or otherwise, or any of the other installations quite yet. We will also start a sort of concurrent discussion with state agencies to engage with the departments in some of these discussions, but that's obviously a very appropriate time to then similarly engage the DoD. Do you have any specific thoughts or recommendations, or just wanted to make sure that we don't lose sight of sort of the totality of what does it mean to develop a climate-ready Oahu? That's obviously not just the city.
Yeah, more the latter, and then the very obvious fact that they are a major controller of land on the island, and also economics, and the list goes on and on and on. So I think they certainly have a big stake.
Yeah, so that's helpful too, not just sort of like recommendations on what we can and should be doing, but if there's specific individuals or organizations or sectors that warrant, even if they may not be serving in the advisory hui, probably should be reached out to for some early discussions. But obviously as well, the community meetings are totally open, and so is this advisory body. But we know that's not always the best way to have the discussion. So we'll leave this open. Don't want to like stymie anyone's thought process. But again, if this is something that you have thoughts on after the meeting or at subsequent meetings, that feedback is extremely appreciated at any point in time.
Just off the top of my head, I don't think this is very practical, but it's almost like we need to put physical signs up in the communities that are going to be most affected, especially coastal communities, and say, this has been identified as a community that is going to be impacted by climate change, by sea level rise by 2050. And then, please join the climate hui to do something to make your voice heard.
Yeah, so more on the communications and how do we at least get this message out, irrespective of what the engagement activity is. Yeah, that's understood as well. I mean, press releases only go so far. We've tried to advertise on any kind of community calendar, whether it's HPR or our own city calendar. You might not even know that we have a city calendar that tells you of events. And then I would also we sort of curated participation in the advisory who we are, or at least the 55 invitations that went out and the ultimate 43 confirmations, because we knew that you all represent or come from geographies, sectors, organizations that additionally have reach. So if it's appropriate and at any point in time, we would be more than happy to engage on the project. However, you know, if we're doing adaptation strategy development exercises, we wouldn't necessarily be able to do that 55 times in the month of January, right? We'd want to make sure that we're also maximizing the open and public opportunities. So we'd appreciate support towards those too. But no hesitation on our end from having phone calls or Zoom conversations with anyone that wants to just talk more about it, even if it's just sharing thoughts and concerns or hopes and dreams.
Are these being shared on, I haven't even checked, but do you guys have like a social media platform or?
Oh, Mona, you're breaking my heart. Yeah.
Did I
There's
miss
so
that
much
part?
content and stuff out there. No, I hear, and that's actually part of the intention around this project promotion participation contract is not everybody's going to follow us, but we know that the messenger matters. So how do we make sure we are doing everything we can to connect with organizations that have reach and have motivated, interested people that are likely interested in this work, but don't necessarily subscribe to our newsletter or follow us at Resilient Oahu across all of the social media platforms. Mona.
Okay, yeah, happy to help out. So I'll connect with you folks.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I think this is a good wrap up of this discussion. Don't hesitate to send us more thoughts. But you know, I was just discussing with our director, Josh, this morning that it's a real challenge doing everything virtually. And we know that that's going to have some shortcomings. We lament not really being out there. I was just so thrilled to see how successful even a toned down or different kind of Arbor Day had been conducted all around the island, and just seeing sort of like the sharing and extension. Pauline just signed off, but she was integral through Malama Learning Center and the Leeward side. I think there's still just this hunger to engage with people in some way, shape, or form in person. So we might need to think of different versions of what does it mean to do like a 90-minute virtual engagement session, and what could you possibly do within the COVID restrictions safely as some kind of pop-up. We're definitely trying to balance all across the board, you know, staff, personnel, as well as really what we had originally intended to do, which were 14 island-wide climate change open houses in March that we never really were able to do, but we know that that gets a lot more folks. And I know we're running up on time, so certainly appreciate people sticking it out. So unless there's any additional comments from the advisory who, I'd like to open it up to members of the public if you have any comments on this agenda item. Thank you, Josie, for the additional thoughts. We've learned a ton through the COVID response, how much language matters. So would be happy to talk with you more about that. Okay, moving along to the next agenda item. Again, no need to dwell too much on it now, but we certainly welcome your thoughts as it relates to this project on things that you would like to hear about or learn from with respect to climate change adaptation measures locally. Certainly open to your thoughts for potential future agenda items as we get into meetings 3, 4, and 5, scheduled tentatively in January, April, and June. So maybe I'll just leave this here, and this is sort of a take-home homework item for you all if you have additional thoughts or recommendations, whether it's, say a briefing from a department about something that they're doing, for example, like Susan mentioned, or if there's some other UH research that's looking at the really pressing coastal erosion issues up on the North Shore, we'd be happy to bring additional voices into the mix at any of the meetings in the future. And I know we're sort of tail end of a cloudy day, so really appreciate people's additional comments in the chat. We'll make sure that we have this in our records moving forward. But unless there's any additional discussion on this agenda item from advisory members or the public, I'm going to move us right along quickly, which will then wrap up our meeting just on time. So before we head to adjournment, are there any comments from members of the public for matters that were not on this posted agenda? Quick scan across the faces and the chat. I see Jeannie's question, and you might have missed it in the audio, Jeannie, in the previous agenda item. Yes, we've already started discussions with the state, and we're looking for ways to bring them into future working sessions with the city agencies as well. Thank you. Okay, hearing none, moving right along to agenda item number 8. I would like to set as a tentative next meeting date, January the 19th, which is a Tuesday. It's actually the day after Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I would ask that you please put that on your calendar and hold it for now if you're able to. Again, 3:30 to 5:30. And that is just a tentative date. Depending on some of the activities and working with the departments, we might adjust that. Not likely to adjust it up sooner, but potentially later. It really depends on the activities, because just as a reminder, the intentions around the advisory WHO is not just to replicate what we do in a community meeting, but it's to make sure that we have discussions early enough to inform decision points along the project timeline. So we'll reassess where we're at and then communicate that back to you all. Jesse, thank you for your comment regarding the timing. We know we're not able to accommodate everybody's preferences or availabilities. We had tried to do a quick polling of availability. The first meeting was 4 to 6 p.m. Folks offered up their thoughts on 3 to 5, 3:30 to 5:30, and 4 to 6, and the majority opinion was 3:30 to 5:30. So I'm going to try to stick with that, but I understand that that might be a conflict for full participation. Thanks, Jesse. Okay, with that, if there aren't any final questions, this meeting is adjourned. So just, thank you all very much for your continued participation. I know the first meeting was a lot, and it was like a lot of level setting, and there wasn't a lot on content. We're glad that we got into a much sort of meatier discussion about a really pressing decision moment that we have. We'll make sure that that's what we're tapping you all for, because that's what was advertised. And then my last plug is thank you to everyone that has confirmed with me your completion of the Sunset Law training. A strong request that we all re-engage with that material, and then let me know once you have completed those 2 State Office of Information Practices online videos. But with all that, I'm going to ask Haley to stop the recording and then just say